It's a great pleasure to be communicating with people who have a passion and commitment for excellence in acupuncture, and a very warm welcome from, well, it's not so warm in Australia at the moment. Cheers.
Thanks. So today's webinar, we're covering constitutions. So this is usually covered in someone's training when they're training, and whether or not that gets used ongoingly in their clinic, we don't really know. So everyone who's joining us will have different experiences, but I'm very interested to know, why are you interested in covering constitutions? And the big question which you always cover is, how is this then relevant to clinical practice?
Thank you, Naomi. That's a good question. You're full of good questions. I appreciate it. I think the key to your second question is striving for excellence in practice. I believe it's the greatest business building attribute we can have, developing our skills and expanding our understanding and our ability to apply the wisdom of the classics, literally speaking. So the constitutions, it's a two-phase or a two-part scenario. The first part is understanding our patient more so, and the more we understand how the patient functions from their appearance and their voice, etc., then the more indication and the more specific our treatments can become. And this, for mine, is very much, it revolves around the more specific and accurate our treatment protocols are, and the less diluted and generalized they are, logic says, and the classics also say, the more potent the treatment. And the more we understand the constitution or the genetic makeup of our patient, then the more potent, positively potent, we would hope, our treatment becomes. And that in turn relates to really the basic business building, practice building etiquette that I'm so keen and inspired to promote. Over and above everything else is to develop our skills, and I'm seriously busy still understanding all of the secrets that Ikeda Sensei's unveiled with the help of Takashi Furei and the editing team around all these, the intricate texts of the classics. So constitution is about improved clinical outcome. There's two aspects to it. One is the preventative aspect in understanding how this person, when this person feels well. Are they feeling good when they're running and perspiring and then they're active? Or do they find that all a little bit too much and they'd rather just chill out on the lounge? What is it that rocks that patient's boat? In understanding that, along with all the other factors, the syndrome factors, the physiology, the pathophysiology, we get another transparency to overlay in the patient, again helping us to make, in the decision-making process, to develop the most potent and the most specific treatment we can.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether to call you Alan Sensei or Dad. Which one's more respectful?
You call me Dad. You call me Al. Oh, yeah.
So you just covered there in your explanation talking about preventative care, and which is definitely, you know, a very big topic in the classical texts on being a superior physician is one who can prevent disease states for their clients. But if we do look at, say, someone who's coming in, a client who's coming in for treatment of a condition, Can you give us a clinical example without, we don't have time to go over every constitution and then how that's going to be applied in a clinical context. It would take us most of the day. But if you could give us one example from clinic, that would be great.
Okay, now I'm going to go slowly, and I know that maybe aspects of this explanation that might be a little difficult to understand, but please cut me a little slack as I do my best to relate the scenario in an intelligible way to everybody, the beginners and the more advanced practitioners and students, without going into in-depth explanation of each or this particular constitution. So we'll look at, say, for instance, for myself, okay? And I'll use me as an example of constitution gone wrong. So I'm what we would describe as a lung deficient constitution. This is related to a number of factors, what rocked my boat as a kid, and also the fact that I have a prodigious amount of bodily hair. Well, not that prodigious, but it's not Mediterranean, but a lot of body hair. Those of us that do have a covering of body hair would normally, we have a fairly significant level of what we call lung deficiency constitution present. The hair is an insulator. So the lung deficient constitution, the key runs a lot more superficially than someone of a spleen deficient constitution. Without going into depth, just trust me that this is my understanding, and that I have from Ikeda Sensei's translation of the classics. So the lung deficient constitution, the characteristic is activity. You know, we like to do stuff, yeah? And we like to move. When we move, we feel better. If we're too sedentary, because we have that action decisive personality where we act now and think later. From a cultural perspective, please excuse me, no offense meant here to anybody, but if we looked at the contrast between the United States government and the Chinese government in regards to cultural separation constitutionally. So the Chinese, as we know, very famous for contemplating and planning before acting. And we can see that in what's happening in the world today in world politics. And the United States, very famous for decisive and action. And so what's happening is there's two very different ways of operating from these two different nations. And this is very much the case for personal constitution of each individual. So my modus operandi, I work best when I move. If I'm sitting too long, if I'm focused on the computer for too long, without movement, my body gives me a message. It can be a number of different things. The back might get a little bit sore, neck and shoulders a little bit sore, I might get some tightness in the jaw, all sorts of factors. Now, bear with me. As a lung deficient constitution, metal feeds water, or the lung is nourishes the kidney, the chi of the lung. So this cycle means that I'm most likely, as a result of excessive amount of activity without consideration, I'm most likely of the constitutions to develop and become kidney deficient constitution. So just to explain that phenomena, so the lung nourishes the kidney. So by the hyperactivity, the kidney becomes deficient over time. I won't go into the details. Let's just say, you know, like I grew up in the 70s. I was a young man in the 70s. All that stuff happened then. And I used a lot of jianye, a lot of fluids. As a result of that, heat comes up. And because of my genetic characteristics, I lose the hair out of the head so that I don't have a stroke. However, what we have as a situation is that I have moved from one constitution to another. So it's very different treating people in their natural flow of aging and within or just without their constitution to treating people with acute disease states. It's a very different kettle of fish. So we're using the constitutions to understand the progress of the disease state or the pathological state or the growth of that particular person. Whereas in acute conditions, we're very focused on what's happening in that immediate moment for that person as distinct from their constitution.
Thank you,
Sensei. I'm not sure, was I clear in my explanation, Naomi?
What I'm wondering, can you now please specifically talk about constitution and the acute presentation and their relationship? And then once we've covered that, would you possibly be able to then cover constitution and a more chronic presentation type patient for us and how that differs?
I've just covered the chronic in the sense that we're watching the elemental cycle. So for me, I went from lung deficient to kidney deficient. So my constitution's actually changed to some degree because of my age. So I'm identifying that for myself, but I'm also in the business of identifying that for the patients. And the chronicity, these are the degenerative diseases that come as a result of life changing, life energy changing. Acute conditions are very, very different. How one suffers is related with acute conditions is definitely related to the constitution, yeah? So if lung deficient constitution, they'll tend to be a little bit more prone to external pathogenic energy. If we have someone that is naturally of a kidney deficient constitution, depending on what imbalances have occurred as a result of kidney deficient constitution, it will affect how they respond to the external pathogenic energy. But the key factor here is the application of traditional acupuncture is we focus on the acute condition, the state as a result of the pathogenic energy, the penetration of the pathogenic energy. So for some people, say, an external pathogenic cold might enter, and because they are of a spleen deficient constitution, they might tend to get more digestive issues. If the patients are maybe of a kidney yang deficient constitution, then they could develop like a food poisoning, a very strong food poisoning reaction because of the chill. The cold penetration energy will hit into the kidney yang as a result of the deficiency. So whereas it'd be very different from for someone who is say of a lung deficient constitution, primarily the effects would be more in the respiratory system than it would be in the digestive system. Not exclusively, because if the pathogenic energy is really strong, I don't know, I've had conditions of the flu where the bones ache. This is a long, long time ago, and complete sweats, etc., etc. That's a strong pathogenic energy hitting into someone who was really deficient at that given time. And in conjunction with what's happening globally at the moment, we can see that the pathogenesis is so much stronger for aged people. And this primarily, from my perspective and my understanding, is because as we age, we become more kidney deficient. So in that relation, our fundamental driving power in the kidney is being affected deleteriously. So eventually, as a result of that, the Wei Qi is not moving effectively or powerfully enough to repel what is apparently a very powerful pathogenic energy. So that's a chronic condition, being kidney deficient, being aged, but responding to an acute pathogenic crisis, in which case we are dealing with the symptomology and the pathology that presents at the time, not so much for the constitution.
Thank you very much for that, breaking that down a little bit further. And just one thing that you did mention, which is interesting. So you mentioned that you were originally lung deficient constitution and have moved to kidney deficiency constitution. So obviously in that statement, what you're saying is that one's constitution can actually change throughout a lifetime.
Yes, and I think to some degree that's perhaps it's more prevalent in moving from lung to kidney because of the 5 elemental, the Shen cycle, because lung deficiency, the lung deficiency actually just means we really always spreading energy without the same consideration of someone of a different constitution. So eventually, because lung nourishes the kidneys, we end up kidney deficient. Everyone ends up more kidney deficient, but I think in the instance of a lung deficient constitution, people have more of a tendency to end up in that kidney deficient state, and it becomes more of a focus. It's also within if we were looking, say, at a liver deficiency constitution, these people, more commonly, the liver deficient constitution are perfectionists. They want to get it right, excuse me, and they want to get it right now. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it right. And culturally, again, if we look at the different cultures in the world, if we looked at the Japanese culture and their willingness and desire to actually develop and refine and evolve is extraordinary. And this is the nature of their constitution. And if we look at the eyes, for instance, for the liver deficient constitution, we're looking at the more almond-shaped eyes. And then we have the liver excess constitution where we have the larger eyes, or we have the kidney deficient constitution tendency towards that with the size of the ears. And then there's all of the other factors we look at to identify the constitution of the individual. I'm not sure that I answered your question there, Naomi. Did I wander off the path?
You did. Well, yes, but so you can be born as a constitution. Well, everyone's born into a constitution, and so physical features will be representing that constitution. Right. You also mentioned that the way that qi flows within the body will be dictated by how the qi best flows in each constitution type, body type. Right. And so then we were just starting to, but I don't think we fully talked about how then one's constitution can change. You just sort of mentioned that
I'll give you an example.
Towards kidney deficiency.
Regardless of the constitution of the individual, if someone were to get or experience a very powerful pathogenic crisis, let's look at hepatitis. And basically, we're affected by hepatitis, and it's usually a lifetime sentence. So from that regard, regardless of what constitution the individual is, once they've had the hepatitis and the liver has been inflamed, depending on the degree, the liver function is affected. So this is really deleterious for someone with a liver deficiency constitution where the liver expresses readily. When we have the liver is affected and this function is compromised and it's unable to fully express, and we develop a pathological liver excess condition, and this can change the person's lifestyle, going from being very active, being a perfectionist, to really just having no energy and not being very excited about life at all. This can also happen in the case of, we have a blood-borne in viral infections here in Australia, somewhat like dengue fever or malaria. We have the Ross River and Barmah Forest fever here more so, and some dengue fever. When people suffer from the dengue fever or the Ross River fever, it's not uncommon for them to go from being incredibly vital. In many cases, I've worked with athletes who have endured this scenario where they've gone from being an elite professional athlete to someone who's just struggled to get out of bed to go to the toilet. And the longer that that condition lasts, then the more it becomes implanted and imprinted as part of their as a constitutional crisis as well as an acute crisis. So there are a couple of ways it can happen, and I'm sure that with the current scenario on the planet at the moment, that people that have actually suffered from this pathology, in many cases, they're changed for life. Their constitution has changed, and in some cases not. But certainly there's some very severe cases where people are just not the same afterwards. And we could say that in many cases, they were no longer in the same constitution they were born because of a severe acute incident. That blood loss can do it, and playing sport and getting injured a lot can also contribute to the change of the constitution of the individual because of the amount of blood stagnation in their body.
Thank you, Alan Sensei. And so what you're mentioning there with the acute, like we don't talk so much about the pathogen changing the constitution, but what you're also talking about there is essentially that wonderful text like Shan Han Lun, which is describing the invasion of an external pathogen, that is too influenced by one's constitution. So that when you're diagnosing and treating a patient, say, looking at Shan Han Lun pathogen, you're in fact taking into consideration the person's constitution and tracking that penetration and the symptomology according to what you understand their constitution to be as well.
Yes, and the goal is, of course, to restore that person back to their most robust and healthiest constitutional state. And the treatment protocol after the acute onset is geared towards that. For instance, if someone were to suffer from just, let's say, a respiratory tract infection where there was an excessive amount of heat in the lung, regardless of whether you call it young yin deficiency, if there's heat in the lung, if that person was of a lung deficient constitution, because of the acute onset, they've developed excess heat in the lung, which can be very severe because they're susceptible to this, and it's the total opposite of their constitutional well-being state. So one of the key factors in the treatment of this individual, in addition to identifying the fundamental deficiency, is to ensure, excuse me, that the excess heat in the lung is expelled as expediently as possible to help them get back to their original state. These people with a lung deficient constitution more commonly would develop respiratory problems and more serious respiratory problems once they had the lung excess condition, like pneumonia, pleurisy. Those types of conditions probably more common in people of a lung deficient constitution. Whereas someone of a kidney deficient constitution, if they were to come down with a pathological invasion, we would be looking at addressing more specifically the pathological invasion, and that the redress usually is in building the spleen energy. The reason we're doing that for the acute onset condition is that this is the core and the center where all the Wei Qi and nutritive Qi is generated. So we want to build up from the inside and make sure that the Wei Qi internally is as strong as it can be, so that as the pathogen tries to penetrate through the different levels as espoused in the Shan Han Lun, we've got the juice to keep it out there. That is understanding that already that the pathogen has passed through the Taiyang level and has moved down into Tai Yin level, yeah, or through Yang Ming. So we have to be, we're looking to bolster from the inside out. So in the main, depending on the acute onset condition and the level of penetration of pathogen, that will govern the type of treatment more so than the constitution of the individual. But we still utilize the understanding of the constitution to implement the treatment.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. And so essentially, you've covered this in the webinar, that you're using constitution in assessment of the patient, using constitution in being able to give advice to patients and clients on how to maintain health. You're using it to inform preventative treatment, and then using it again in basically pretty much any presentation that's coming into the clinic, whether it's acute or chronic. So essentially it's a core component of your assessment, treatment and prognosis within the clinic environment. So with that in mind, and if there may be something that else you want to add to that, but could you also just cover for us, especially for anyone who perhaps didn't get an in-depth education on constitution in their training, or perhaps they're a new practitioner, new in clinic, how to get started with implementing, using information around constitution? What are the best ways to get started with working with our clients?
I'm sure that the education system has changed since I went through. I certainly hope so. But I think it's important to understand that understanding constitutions and knowing the constitution is a vital part of being an accomplished practitioner. It's not just a separate thing that you look at, the size of the eyes, the size of the ears, the lips, etc. This is actually part of the medicine. The understanding, and we integrate that into our practice, that really makes a difference. So for instance, the liver, we're taught that the liver is reflected in the eyes, but I'm not so sure that we're taught that the size of the eyes will normally reflect the size of the organ. So if we have large eyes, then correspondingly, according to traditional East Asian medicine and the ancient classics, it means that we have a large liver. So if we have a large liver, we need a lot of yin yang to support the liver, a lot of fluids coming from the kidney. Yeah, so we need to be strong in the kidneys. So that's one aspect. If someone's got large ears, if they're folded forward like that, very much so, then this is significant and indicates the condition of the kidney. The color of the ears will indicate the condition of the kidney. The size of the nose indicates the condition to some degree of the lung and the size of the lung. The body hair cover indicates the size of the rib cage. This is all relevant to the lung deficient. For kidney deficient, the ears, and for the spleen the deficient constitution, we look at the lips. Mine, for instance, I haven't got my digestive system's okay, but it's not brilliant. I would need a larger lip here, a little that would bolster the digestion. So I have a little susceptibility in that area. The mouth is big enough though. It was a joke. It brings another level or depth of understanding of that person that we're treating, and another way of individualizing the treatment. As I said at the very beginning, this is not about acupuncture working. This is about acupuncture, our acupuncture as practitioners, working to the absolute best optimal level that it can. And we all have limitations, without doubt. Even Ikeda Sensei at this stage in his life having written 24 textbooks, is still studying. These keys, these indications, they're all in the ancient classics. All of this, none of this is original, none of this is my special thought. I've inherited this as a result of Takashi Furue's dedication to translating Hikita Sensei's books into English. So it's veritable gold mine. I absolutely love it. I'm really inspired, and I'm very, very grateful in my senior years of practice to be able to work deeply in and give more depth. And it's like the tree. We can have a thin tree that bends easily, or as we grow older and each layer of bark becomes part of the tree and the tree becomes bigger. This is the nature of traditional acupuncture. We can't know it all through one workshop, one seminar, one webinar. I can point to you and say, look, there's a lot of room here to learn, and you can choose to do that or not to. But for mine, the benefit is in the color and the texture. Understanding these principles puts into the actual clinical practice.
Thank you very much, Alan Sensei. So for beginning clinicians, one of the easiest ways for them to start using constitutional sort of diagnosis and information to input to their treatment assessment and plan is understanding that those classical correspondences of liver to eyes, it's not just about that eye pathology equals liver pathology. So we're talking about that the physical features that are prevalent with that person is expressing their constitution. So that observational assessment within your meeting client for the first time is perhaps one of the easier ways, and then working out whether or not, you know, certain features are of that person's normal, or if it's changed for some reason due to a pathology, that level of assessment.
Yep. Yeah, I think I can retire happily and leave you to take over, Naomi. Thank you. That was beautiful. For translating for me. So to understand that the Constitution, this business of the wood and the metal and the sour, the astringent, the stimulative, all of these things that come up on the chart, on the 5-element chart, the kidney, water, all of this is so beautifully integrated in the classics. And it is more than just the chart. It does have a meaning. So if we're working with someone who is visually compromised, which Naomi and I have done over the years, we know most commonly that person will be constitutionally liver deficient. Understanding the implications of that is very important and takes study. So let's look at it. Just to give an example, liver deficiency, in this instance, I'm referring to the Jin-Yang or liver yin deficiency. As a result of the lesser amount of yin, we naturally have more yang energy. So when the yin or the Jin-Yang is balanced with the yang energy, it merrily takes the blood around the body, nourishes the eyes, we sleep well, and ligaments and tendons feel good, and we're expansive, we can grow, we're clear thinking, and we're decisive. If the Jin-Yang supply from the kidney becomes a little deficient, and then the liver blood, the Jin-Yang, the yin in the liver becomes a little deficient, then there's an excess amount of yang qi moving in the body, and it's not being directed by the yin. So it's doing whatever it wants. So commonly it'll rise up the gallbladder meridian, and also commonly will affect the yang ming. So this is the expression from a traditional East Asian medical perspective of visual pathologies. in many, many instances, it will be a result of the person's DNA or constitutional imbalance, or as a result of overuse. It can happen. But again, there'll always be that genetic tendency, almost always be, to have visual disturbance. And this is really important to understand, to know how to treat this condition, not as a vision impairment, but from the perspective of the traditional medicine. Like, this person is liver deficient, yin deficient. How do we put a treatment together that's aligned with their classical diagnosis to help us make an accurate prognosis and let them know this treatment, we should have you better in 3 treatments, or this might take us 10 treatments to get you better. This is really important to understand why an athlete would be suffering from hamstring problems from running. What is happening in their body? It's a hamstring issue, so we put needles in the hamstring? Yes, perhaps. But most importantly, we're wanting to understand why they're injuring their hamstring.
Thank you. I almost feel like I could go down a whole other track with that last one about using constitutional treatments for acute injuries, but I think maybe it's best to see if people have got questions.
That's a great idea.
That I've answered so far. That might be good to do that now. And then perhaps after that.
Just before we do, there's 10 major constitutions. And I just wanted to say that there are 10 major constitutions. There's a lot of information on the constitutions in one of the books that Ikuta Sensei's written that Maria will talk about later. Thank you, Nan.
Thank you. So I think what we're going to do now is, if you have a question, we're just going to go across to Maria, and she's going to help direct the question time with Alan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. Brilliantly done.
Thank you. So I invite everyone that has a question to write it on the chat. We already have here some questions from Krasimira. So the first question that she has put, it was while you were explaining. So is there an obvious pathology connected with every constitution?
Yeah, I would say yes, Krasimira. There are tendencies. The kidney deficient constitution, probably, especially in males, more related to urogenitary problems. Not always, at all, but there's a tendency, because if we look, the kidney and the bladder are related, and so any imbalance in the kidney will commonly affect the bladder meridian and then the bladder organ. The spleen imbalances, more digestive issues, is a tendency to have those types of issues over and above respiratory issues or urogenitary issues. Lung deficient constitution will tend to suffer from more like sinusy type issues on the stiff neck and shoulders, and perhaps, depending on their constitution, repeated respiratory issues. For instance, as a lung deficient constitution child, I had no idea. Nor did my parents really. They did their best, but I drank an enormous amount of milk and an enormous amount of ice cream. This resulted in me having a diabolical childhood with respiratory problems as a result of my lung deficient constitution. And most of the people here would, on the workshop, in the webinar, would understand that the constant consumption of sweet and cold foods would affect the spleen and digestion, and that tie-in, that's the lung and the spleen, that function would be affected. So I experienced terrible respiratory conditions every winter as a kid as a result of that. Now, and liver deficient constitution, I guess the tendency there is because there's an upward and outward movement. The liver is quite, a very active organ in that sense would tend to the headaches and visual disturbance. And certain sorts of insomnia would be attributed to the liver deficient constitution. So yeah, generally they're aligned, so that if it's an imbalance of the kidney, it will tend to go to the related Fu meridian and then Fu organ, rather than to another Zhang organ or to another Zhang meridian. That would be in the first instance. But then as the pathology developed, it's quite possible for the disturbance to move to another level entirely. For instance, the kidney deficiency could affect the heart, could also affect the stomach, with the stomach being overheated. So there are those variations, but in the first instance, the imbalance will tend to go towards the Fu meridian and then the Fu organ, associated Fu meridian organ.
Thank you, Alan. She has another question here, and I invite everyone to make questions, but I'm gonna ask Krasimir a question. So, what about a patient with large eyes, and with large eyes that are connected with the liver excess constitution, and that at the same time has a protruding ear ilex, which is connected with liver deficient constitution? So, what would be the constitution of this patient?
This is from Casimira.
Yes.
Well, the primary issue is the size of the eyes will dictate the size of the liver. But then, as a result of that ear shape, not the ear shape, the ear shape of the helix protruding like that, rather than the ear being like this is the ear being like so. This dictates that there's a lack of Jianye going to the liver. So whilst the person has a liver excess constitution, they're going to be experiencing, they'll have more volatile temperament than the general, this liver deficient constitution with the big eyes and the ears, they'll tend to be more of a genteel personality. But with the big eyes, we know that there's a big liver, but with the ears back, then there'll be tend a little bit more of a to the personality, a rough edge.
Thank you, Alan, for your answer. At the moment, we don't have here any more questions.
That's all right.
Oh, I just have one here. Okay, it's from Marek. Let me see if I can make the question right. How does your constitutional model compares to GAR Worsley's 5-element typology, which focuses very much on the psycho-emotional aspects of the patient? Maybe it's, if you all also take into account the psycho-emotional aspect into constitution. Probably that's the question.
Absolutely, the psycho-emotional aspect of the constitution is important. No question about that. This is not my model, by the way, just to be really clear, Marek. This is from the classics. There's no dilution here. The Hikita Sensei is interpreted and translated, and it's been translated in the most unadulterated form. So we are actually talking about the classics, not about my model. Yeah. So I just really need to be clear about that. None of what I'm espousing is my model. I'm certainly putting it through the lens of my experience, but the model is based on the classical Chinese text. Worsley, I understand something of the Worsley system. I do know that he renamed all the points, but I can't really comment because I haven't studied that system. My attention has been arrested by the classical text and the traditional Chinese medicine in essence, rather than going to any other area of study. But certainly the psycho-emotional aspects, what came first, the chicken or the egg? The psycho-emotional aspects can cause imbalance, and imbalance can cause the psycho-emotional aspect. So without a doubt, it's an important part of the makeup of a human being, of an individual, but it's also subject to their constitution.
Alan, thank you. Could you actually give an example of like how would you characterize a constitution, different constitution according to the way they behave, like something that would be very particular to a constitution? So
I'd be delighted to. So the kidney deficient constitution will go one or two ways, depending whether yin or yang deficient. So they tend to be quite courageous. Kidney yin deficient constitution people are that it's fight or flight. So in this case, it's more they have a really firm stance, and they tend to be very what shall we say? The coloured races tend to be more what we collectively call kidney deficient because of the colour of skin, as distinct from the Asian races, which would tend to be more spleen and liver deficiency as a result of the colour of the skin. And then we've got the Caucasians who tend to be pale white skin with the hairy cover. So the Caucasians, if you like, or excuse me, the lung deficient constitution, they tend to act quickly and in many cases with ill-considered consequences, because they don't think so much. They're very quick to move, quick to act, quick to do things. Okay, let's do this. And let's do it now. And from that sense, they can be leaders in that way, and that they will act spontaneously. The liver deficient constitution, they'll tend to be, they act, but they act in a more decisive way. Yeah, because of the liver deficiency, the horn. And the horn is where the decision maker, and that's expressed, or the gallbladder is the decision maker, but the hood is the planner. So from that perspective, they tend to be decisive, and they tend to have plans. And they're great people for executive positions in companies, etc., etc. Spleen deficient constitution people tend to be more contemplative and more deeply thoughtful. So I guess from that aspect, if you would look at the Chinese culture and the way it's developed, it's very steadfast, it's very solid, and it moves in a very logical, omnipotent way. It's because it's the earth, yeah. So it's you take one step, whereas the lung deficient's more that way, and the liver deficient is more that way, and the kidney deficient constitution's more that way. Yeah, I guess that's a way I can explain it. The kidney deficient constitution individual born into kidney deficiency, they tend to change more dynamically in their bodies at middle age. As they become more significantly kidney deficient, then there's a propensity to hold water and to have problems with their weight as they get a bit older. Whereas as younger people, they're well built, they're strong, and they're motivated, and they're great warriors. Yeah. Was that satisfactory, Maria?
yes, thank you, Alan. Okay. Yeah, there's so much information that you cannot go into depth at the moment.
I'd love to go into depth.
We have here another question from Daniel Roma. He's asking, could you advise us, please, a book or a chapter of classic book to approach the question of the Constitution? So while you talk about it, I'm actually going to share here the short page from World Acupuncture, so you can explain them, talk about this book, which is this one.
Daniel, thank you for your question, and thank you also, Krasimira and Marek. I really appreciate your questions. This is a wonderful book. This comes to the beach with me, and I'm sorry to say this. Well, I'm not really. I go to the beach most days for a little while anyway, and we can do that here. We're very fortunate, and I'm very, very grateful. But you can see that there's a bit of wear and tear here. This old girl, she's seen a lot of clips, been around the world with me a couple of times. It's a beautiful book because it's very diverse in its coverage, and devotes probably about 50 pages or 2 chapters to the constitutions. I haven't come across anything even vaguely as authoritative in regards to constitutions as to the chapters devoted to that subject in this book, The Contemporary Clinical Foundations of the Classics. Absolutely brilliant. It was written some time ago. Ikuta Sensei has definitely evolved since the writing of this book, but it has set a huge benchmark for me, and it's a book that I study on a daily basis. And there's definitely material in that book to suit those people that are keen and interested.
If you have access to World Acupuncture website, you can also have Alan teaching and explaining more in depth about the constitutions. So you have the book, but you also have the resource in online video learning through worldacupuncture.com. We have here one more question from Powell. Could you please comment on heart or pericardium constitution expression?
The classics don't refer to the heart, pericardium, or the heart in particular, because it's the emperor, and it's felt that, you know, the other components of the hierarchy are more important in protecting the emperor, and the emperor should be isolated away from the day-to-day realities. Pericardium, not as a constitution, but certainly as a syndrome. There are issues with the pericardium and how it functions in connection with the spleen and the Ming Men and the triple warmer, etc., as a kidney yang deficiency or kidney yang energy as well, the Ming Men. But really, according to the classics, they don't refer to the heart or pericardium constitutions at all.
Thank you so much, Alan, for all the explanation and all the answers to the questions, and also Naomi for being here and guiding the interview. So I will just share a little bit about the resources that you can have access to World Acupuncture. So we already shared with you that there are books being sold at the shop, and you can also have access to a 3-day video seminar. I just realized I'm sharing with you a page in Portuguese. I'm sorry, but I will explain. So these are the books that are in the shop in worldacupuncture.com. And then there's also a seminar with Masakazu Ikeda for 3 days that you have also access to CPD points. And also, the whole website is a 15-year-old online learning platform of traditional Japanese acupuncture. You have more than 200 video lessons with Alan Sensei, and he goes through all sorts of explanations of the medicine, focusing a lot on diagnosis and on real treatment with patients in clinic. And you can also have access to private sessions with Alan, like he could tutor you and help you in the understanding of the medicine. So you are free to contact him anytime with questions and work with him. So I will pass the word to Alan and Naomi to conclude the session for today.
I wanted to say a massive thank you, Dad, Alan Sensei, for sharing on something so potentially, yielding of great long-term benefits for our patients. Seemingly such a simple concept that may or may not be getting used in clinical practice. So thank you so much for taking the time to go over how we can start moving towards the deeper core of understanding traditional Chinese medicine in the treatment of pathology, which I feel is so beneficial, being someone who moved over from Western medicine to traditional East Asian medicine. There can be a tendency to adopt a treatment of pathology approach even within acupuncture schools, which is something I noticed during my training, and was just so wonderful to be able to train under yourself and under Masakazu Ikeda Sensei to really come into that true understanding of finding the root cause of illness and pathology for someone and seeing the whole picture. So I just really appreciate the time that you've taken to break that down for me and for everyone. And yeah, passing it over to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, for being an amazing student and an amazing daughter. Thank you so much, Maria, for your amazing efforts over the last 4 or 5 years. We would not be here without you. That's very, very grateful. I'd like to close in acknowledging the awesome work of Takashi Fure and his editing team in being able to bring several of Ikuta Sensei's texts translating into English. They're now available, as you've seen, on the website. And of course, none of this would have been possible without Masakazu Ikuta Sensei, with his incredible, inspirational level of commitment to excellence in practice. And lastly, to each and every one of you that have stayed up or delayed dinner or are eating dinner whilst watching this webinar, it's been a real pleasure. I hope you've gained something from it. It's all about excellence in practice. It's all about improving the clinical outcomes for our patients, which in turn will improve our prosperity in practice. Thanks again for attending. We'll see you again probably in about a month's time.
Yeah, we will be sharing another webinar probably in 1 month's time, but we will send an email and share in the social media. Thank you everyone, and bye-bye.